I'm registered in this class.
What class?
This is US History.
Welcome back, young scholars. In the next two videos, we are taking a trip back in time to Jamestown.
Amigos, time to depart.
Now, this is the first British colony in North America. And as we learned in the last video, the English attempted a permanent colony at Roanoke, but it was a major fail. So would the colonists learn the lessons of Roanoke? Well, I guess you'll just have to watch the video to find out. Now, there are two big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video. The first is, what motives brought the colonists to Jamestown? And then, how is life in the colony different than maybe the colonists expected? And then, what hardships did the colonists face in establishing Jamestown? And how did they overcome these challenges? Now, Jamestown is important because it's the first successful British colony in the New World. It was located in Virginia, just north of the lost colony of Roanoke. And it was named after this guy, King James I, who granted a group called the Virginia Company a charter to establish the colony. On the right, you can see the original charter, the Virginia Charter. And I encourage you to stop and read it. Here I've pulled out some excerpts or some sections of the charter that I think are really important. Now, a charter is basically a document signed by the king establishing a colony's right to exist. And back then, the king or queen of England was, an ultimate authority. And they were kind of like the parents, and the British colonists were like the kids. And the kids needed to get the king or queen's permission, their parents' permission, before setting out for the New World on their field trip. So charters are the king or queen's written permission to set up that colony. Charters also established some ground rules for the new colony. And there are three types of colonial governments that you're going to learn about in this course, and a charter colony is one type. And for now, I just want to briefly mention that the Virginia Company was originally established as a charter colony. I just want to plant that seed, and then we'll later discuss the three types of colonial governments in a later video. Hopefully that'll give you some water, and maybe that seed will start to sprout. Now, the second question the actual question that I want to take up now is, why form a company to start a colony? Now, think about Roanoke for a second. Big failure, right? Well, after Roanoke, the English king or queens probably viewed the colonies as too risky. They saw what happened at Roanoke. So they left it to private British citizens to establish these colonies, which is a very different model than in New Spain, where the colony was financed exclusively by the king or queen of Spain. Well, English merchants looked at the Spanish colonies, and they believed there was money to be made. Show me the money. None of the merchants, these British merchants, individually could afford the high startup costs of colonization. So these individual merchants formed groups called a joint stock company. And the company's goal was to make a profit or to make money in the New World. The Virginia Company was an example of a joint stock company. Here you can see the Virginia Company seal, or in other words, the company logo. And this was what they would put on, company documents. Does it look familiar? Oh, here we see modern day companies like McDonald's or Starbucks, and this is how these companies would represent themselves. Now, the Virginia Company, these joint stock companies, were in many ways just precursors to the modern day corporation. Right? Their goal was to make money, to make profit in the New World. And another advantage of forming a joint stock company was that if the colony bombed, if it failed completely like Roanoke, the loss was spread out among the individual investors. So let's get back to our first big question. What were the motives of the Virginia Company in establishing Jamestown? Well, as I just mentioned, what do all colonies want to do? They want to make money, of course. And at first, the colonists who traveled to Jamestown had one thing in mind, which was finding gold.
I need me gold!
And gold was initially how the Jamestown colonists were going to make money, just like the Spanish had done before, right? The colonists had a secondary motive, and if you read the charter on the last slide, you'll know what that was. And that's, the colonists sought to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. Now, here we can see a picture of a Native American that most of you probably are familiar with, Pocahontas. Here she's being baptized into Christian religion. Now, the third motive for the colonists in establishing Jamestown was that they were still looking for that elusive water route to Asia, believe it or not. Ever since Christopher Columbus, who set sail west to find that water route, trade route to Asia, the colonists, Europeans at the time, still believed that water route, maybe through a river or whatever, still existed. And so colonists were still looking for that. Now, the Jamestown colonists ran into problems almost the minute they stepped off the boat. They built Jamestown on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, on the shores of the James River, which is on the Chesapeake Bay in what is today Maryland and Virginia. And they built the land that they built this colony on was basically a swamp. It was a marsh. It was not the best place to build a colony. And anyone who's ever been to a swamp knows that one of the things that swamps are full of is mosquitoes. Not only are mosquitoes annoying, but they are also deadly because they carry diseases like malaria. And then a second problem with building a colony on swampland was that the water that the colonists could use to drink was really bad. And as a result of this location, many of the Jamestown colonists died from diseases. Now, a second problem the Jamestown colonists faced had to do with the colonists themselves. Many of the original Jamestown settlers were wealthy gentry. And in fact, all of them were men that set sail in sort of the original waves of colonists who traveled to Jamestown. And in fact, in that first wave, there were 104 men and 0 ladies. Now, this picture, which supposedly shows the landing of the colonists of Jamestown, is historically inaccurate. So we're going to have to fix that. Here we see 2 ladies, or maybe cross-dressing men, but my guess is they were probably ladies. So we're going to have to delete them because there were no ladies in the first years at Jamestown. And as you probably can already imagine, that's going to create a problem. But what I like about this picture was that the guys in this picture appear to be pretty well dressed, which likely would have been the case, given that they were most of them were pretty wealthy. But wealthy men of the 17th century were notorious for being one thing. Wealthy men today are probably the same way. They're lazy, right? And the men who went to Jamestown were no different. Most of them felt it was beneath them to do hard work, which is what's required to start a colony. Is incredibly, incredibly demanding hard work. And they were also pretty utterly unprepared for the wilderness. It's like if you dropped the Kardashians in the middle of the woods and told them to survive. Now again, they were looking for non-existent gold, so most of the supplies that they brought with them turned out to be utterly useless. Now, how did the colonists solve or overcome this problem of being lazy and unprepared? Well, we left it to one man. It was one of the first leaders of Jamestown, and his name was John Smith. And he instituted a strict disciplinary code at Jamestown. And Smith's #1 rule is he who does not work will not eat. And the shortened version is work or starve. And the punishment for breaking the rules at Jamestown was incredibly harsh by today's standards. For example, if you failed to attend church service on Sunday 3 times, you were put to death. And for those of you who have seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, John Smith's name may be familiar. And we'll talk more about Mr. Smith in the next video on Jamestown. But life from Jamestown went from bad to worse in 1609. There was a severe drought that year. And not only was there a lack of water, but without water there was no way to grow crops. And living in Jamestown in the winter of 1609 was a living hell. This was a period known as the starving time. And here I found an excerpt of a diary of a Jamestown colonist describing what life was like, and I encourage you to read it. But what he describes was that the men were so hungry that they ate their horses. When they ran out of horse meat, they ate the leather in their shoes or their boots. And some men resorted to the ultimate act of desperation when you're starving, which is cannibalism or the eating of human flesh. 90% of the men at Jamestown died the winter of the starving time. And you can see here we have a graph showing the population of Jamestown over time. And you can see that winter of 1609 to 1610, the population basically fell off a ledge, decreased dramatically. And again, 90% of the Jamestown colonists died during that period. Now, the men who did survive were preparing to leave when a supply ship headed by this man, Lord Delaware, arrived. Now, if that last name looks familiar or sounds familiar, it's because a state is named after him, the first state of Delaware. Now, Mr. Delaware, or Lord Delaware, probably seemed like a savior to the colonists after that starving time in 1609, bringing the needed supplies that allowed the colony to survive. But ultimately, if the colony was going to survive and be saved for the long run, they were going to need something else. And if they were to avoid that fate of Roanoke, something needed to come along to save the Jamestown colony. And the savior of the Jamestown colony was none other than Tobacco, tobacco. Now, tobacco was introduced as a cash crop by the second John from Jamestown, a guy named John Rolfe. Now, one way to keep our two Johns straight, John Smith and John Rolfe, straight, is that you can roll tobacco into a cigarette. So John Rolfe was the tobacco guy. John Smith was the guy that introduced a strict disciplinary code. Now, tobacco was very popular at the time in England. And the climate was good for growing. The climate in Virginia was good for growing tobacco. Now, pretty soon the colonists were growing it everywhere, in the streets, in the cemeteries. And by 1630, over 1.5 million pounds of tobacco was being exported from Jamestown. Now, no longer were the colonists looking for gold. Now they were planting as much tobacco as they could to sell to European markets. And this was a much more allowed the colony to sustain themselves in a much stronger way than had they continued to search for non-existent gold in Jamestown. But relying on tobacco, exclusively on tobacco, as the only form of, as a singular cash crop, comes with its own set of problems. And the first problem was that the colony's success was tied directly to two things: the weather and the worldwide price and demand for the product. Now, a second problem is that tobacco is very labor and land intensive. What I mean by labor intensive is that it takes a lot of people working a lot of long hours to plant, grow, and harvest tobacco. Now, where is that labor going to come from? Well, again, the colonists need more workers to keep up with the increased demand in Europe for this product. They need to find this labor source. Where is it going to come from? Well, the solution at first is indentured servants. And we'll talk more about indentured servants in a later video when we talk about what life was like in Virginia. But that's only a short-run solution for the early colonists. Eventually, they're going to turn to, the solution is going to be African slaves. It's going to supply that labor source that's going to be necessary to grow this labor-intensive crops like tobacco. Now, a second problem is that the colonists need more land because tobacco is very land-intensive, and you can only grow it. You have to leave your fields fallow or barren in between growing season, and so you need more and more land in order to grow tobacco. Now, what's the problem with needing more land? Here we can see the first slaves that arrived in Jamestown. Now, what's the problem with taking more and more land? Well, you're gonna the land's not vacant. You're gonna have to take it from the Indians, and the Indians again surrounded Jamestown. And this is where we're going to pick up in the next video, is discussing the relationship between the Jamestown colonists and the local Native American tribes. But before we go, let's return to our two big questions, our learning targets, or our big questions. And first is, what motives brought the colonists to Jamestown? And how is life different than expected? And then what hardships did the colonists face in establishing Jamestown? And how did they overcome these challenges? And hopefully, after watching this video, you can answer both those questions. As always, thanks for watching.